Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Brooks with the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to CORES 2023, Let There Be Light, Religion and the Birth of Modern Science. CORES stands for Conversations on Religion, Ethics, and Science, and is a collaborative project created to address critical issues through respectful, informed, and productive dialogue. Before meeting the panel, we want to recognize those individuals and units at ASU that have helped make this possible, with the first of those being our project directors. Barry Ritchie is Professor of Physics, and Ben Sanders heads the Arizona Center for Christian Studies. We thank them for their inspiration and leadership. Second, we want to recognize all of the units who have co-sponsored this event, including Beyond, Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science, the Center for Gender Equity in Science and Technology, the Center for Jewish Studies, Council for Arabic and Islamic Studies, the Council of Religious Advisors, and the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Finally, we want to thank the John Templeton Foundation, who made this event possible through a grant in support of the CORES project. Now, I would like to turn the time over to our moderator, Pauline Davies. Pauline is an award-winning broadcaster and professor of practice in the Hugh Downs School of Human Communication. Pauline, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Our topic today looks at how some of the great religious traditions of the world influence the birth of science. And you're in for a treat. Members of our panel are known for their knowledge of religion, science, and philosophy, and as being passionate public communicators. They are Professor Jim Al-Khalili, an expert on science and Islam, and the Reverend Canon Professor Keith Ward, who studied the role of Christianity in the development of science. They both join us from the UK. And to bring in other perspectives, we have Harvard Tirosh-Samuelson, Director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at ASU, and physicist Paul Davies, Director of the Beyond Center, again at ASU. Well, first, some background about the subject. Science didn't spring into being ready-made from a vacuum. There was a rich cultural history behind it that helped lay the conceptual foundations, including centuries of thought by philosophers and theologians about how the world is organized, our place within it, and the ultimate nature of reality. Monotheism, the belief in only one God, had a deep influence on European thought at the time of Galileo and Newton, but the underlying framework stretches back centuries before that. Today, science and theology are often seen as in tension, but that wasn't always so, as we'll hear from our speakers. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Jim Al-Khalili, and Jim's going to talk for 25 minutes. Jim is a theoretical quantum physicist and science popularizer, and he's won numerous awards for his work. Jim was born in Baghdad to a Shia Muslim father and a British Christian mother, but his family left Iraq when he was a teenager and returned to the south of England, where Jim is now a distinguished professor at the University of Surrey. He's also a distinguished public communicator of science. He writes academic and popular books and regularly presents science documentaries on BBC radio and TV, which can be viewed and listened to throughout the world. Jim has also written and broadcast extensively about the rise of his Islamic science. And one fascinating three-part BBC TV series of Jim's from a few years ago was about the golden age of Islamic science in the 8th and 9th centuries. He later wrote the highly acclaimed book, The House of Wisdom, on the same subject. Jim is the ideal expert to answer the question, how did key ideas in Islamic thought ultimately prove critical to the birth of science? Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Although it's good evening for us here in the UK. It's just gone 7 p.m. As Pauline mentioned in her introduction, I have this strange background. Shia Muslim father verging on the agnostic, a quite devout Protestant Christian mother. I ended up being a theoretical physicist and not particularly religious at all. But I have this passion for understanding how these ideas developed, how they interacted, what influence religions had, particularly the Abrahamic religions in the Middle East, influenced science. As Pauline mentioned, I made this 3-part BBC documentary back in 2009, I believe it first aired. Partly because I had a passion, having spent most of my schooling in Iraq, although English is my first language because we spoke English at home, my mother tongue, literally. I did my schooling in Arabic, and we learnt about some of these scholars during the medieval period in the Middle East, in the early days of the Islamic Empire. But they, even in the Middle East, even in the Arab world, they weren't taught as part of science, their contribution to science, but simply as great scholars, figures in history. So I wanted to dig into some of their works and just find out how that period in the early medieval sort of 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, how that fed into the development of modern science come the Renaissance in Europe. So, of course, we tend to think of, we have the household names. We know about Newton and Galileo and thereafter. We also know about many of the great Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Plato and Euclid and Ptolemy and Galen and so on. Partly because certainly in Europe, once with the fall of the Roman Empire and Europe going to the Dark Ages, there is this narrative that nothing happened anywhere of anything of interest anywhere in the world. Whereas, of course, there were flourishing civilizations in China, in India, and of course, in the Islamic world, North Africa and the Middle East. So I want to focus and say a little bit about why that period was particularly interesting and exciting, why historians of science refer to it as a golden age in the development of science. I've got some slides, so I'm going to share my screen. So Pauline mentioned this book that I wrote. So it's the same, but it looks like I've written 2 books here. It's the same. In the UK, it came out with the title Pathfinders. In the US, The House of Wisdom. It was basically prompted first by the TV documentary, but having made the documentary, I realized I wanted to dig into this a little bit more. So I put on hold a lot of my academic work in physics, research into quantum mechanics, and did a lot of digging into researching into this period in the Islamic world to find out exactly how and why it took place. Well, of course, Islam emerged out of Arabia in the 7th century very suddenly, very quickly swept through the whole of the Middle East. But it wasn't immediately obvious that this was going to be a golden age of scholarship, of rationalism, of writing. That had to wait until the middle of the 8th century with the birth of the Abbasid Empire. Now, the Abbasids, they created their new capital, Baghdad. Partly the reason why I sort of had some affinity to that period, because I was born in Baghdad. So this in fact a Christian hospital run by nuns on the banks of the Tigris River in 1962, and I realized that it would have been just a couple of miles downriver from the birth of one of the greatest caliphs of the Islamic Empire, the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who in fact was the son of a caliph that in the West we know rather better, Harun al-Rashid, because Harun al-Rashid is the character who appears in 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights stories. Certainly during the period of Harun al-Rashid, this early Abbasid dynasty saw an expansion of the Islamic Empire all the way to sort of northern Spain in the west and India, almost butting up to China in the east. It was a huge, huge empire. And it was wealthy, it was powerful. This is a lovely oil painting, 19th century painting, depicting the great King Charlemagne, who was the great power in Europe in that period, visiting Baghdad and visiting al-Rashid, the caliph, and being, the historians write, in awe of the opulence of Baghdad, which was then the largest city in the world, the first city by some accounts to have more than 1 million population. But Harun al-Rashid himself wasn't particularly interested in scholarship and science and learning. It was his son, Al-Ma'mun, who created what we now refer to as the House of Wisdom. And there's no archaeological site extant today to tell us what the House of Wisdom was like, but we believe it was some form of translation house come library come place that pulled together scholars who would receive patronage from the caliph and the hierarchy of the Abbasid Empire to do science and study theology and poetry and art and literature and so on. Because the Abbasids were obsessed with scholarship, something they inherited. They had very strong links with Persia. And Persia was the great empire. But one scholar referred to a Persian talking to the Arabs, saying, "Well, you Arabs, you have all the words because Arabic became the official language of the empire, but we Persians have all the ideas." It was certainly a time when a lot of different ideas came together under one banner. So the big question is why? Why did it happen then? Well, of course, the first reason is because the Abbasids encouraged scholarship and learning. When they reached the borders of the empire, rather than for their if they would take over another particular dynasty or kingdom, they wouldn't come back with gold. They would come back with texts, with books, and there then began this incredible translation movement. So here you can see from this map the extent of the empire, the capital Baghdad, one or two other cities that Cairo and Cordoba, of course, were very important. Damascus, a very much older city than either Baghdad or Cairo. And between about 800 and 1000 AD, I never know whether to say AD, Anno Domini, or CE Common Era. The historians argue about whether we say AD BC or CE BC. Anyway, during that period, a couple of centuries, was this incredible translation movement where the Abbasid caliph and the hierarchy of the Abbasid Empire would provide patronage to scholars to take books, many of them the great texts from ancient Greeks, the texts of Aristotle and Plato and others, and translate them into Arabic, but also translating other texts from Syriac and Pahlavi and Sanskrit into Arabic. Because, of course, the second reason why this was a golden age was because suddenly this huge area of the old world had an official language. It wasn't the language that everyone spoke, of course, but the official language of the Abbasid Empire was Arabic, because it was the language of the Quran. What it meant was any scholar, be they Christian, Jewish, Persian, Arab, if they wanted their work to be known, to be disseminated, they would have to write their texts in Arabic. Added to that, the Islamic world used the invention of paper by the Chinese to be able to write lots of books and disseminate many copies of texts far more cheaply than they had done before with parchment, for example. The translation movement meant that, in particular, to begin with, it was the text that people were. Certainly the great scholars, the Christian and Jewish scholars in the Middle East, would have been well aware of the work of Plato and Aristotle and Ptolemy, and would have translated those texts into Syriac and Hebrew and so on. They then got translated into Arabic, and there grew this collection of great texts. Almost overlapping with that period, maybe slightly after, was then a reverse translation from Arabic back mainly into Latin. So this is long before the Renaissance in Europe. Europe is still stuck in the Dark Ages. This is the age of the Crusades. But there were pockets, European scholars around Europe, who would travel to cities like Baghdad, like Cordoba, Toledo, and they would initially looking for the great texts of the Greeks that they would have been well aware of, but then realizing either those texts didn't exist in the Greek anymore, so they had to learn Arabic to translate the Arabic versions into Latin, or discovering there were original texts in Arabic that had taken Greek thinking way beyond anything that they had expected. So I've got a sort of a whole list of the greats and the good of this period and what they did. I just wanted to pick a few examples of some of these scholars to talk about what they had done. Another reason why this new religion of Islam kick-started a flourishing period. On the one hand, I mean, we have to bear in mind, this was certainly under the Abbasids, a very tolerant dynasty. The scholars who were working in various areas of science were by no means all Muslims. There were many scholars, Christians and Jewish and Sabian and pagans, and who were receiving the same sort of patronage as the Muslim scholars. It was encouraged, and so, for example, advances in medicine. In the writings of Islam, there's this great emphasis placed on cleanliness, and that meant that there was a flourishing of ideas in building new hospitals and developing medical techniques. Certainly, one of the great early translators, a Christian translator by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq in the 9th century, was one of the first people to translate the medical texts of Galen. And he took it further. So he not only would he translate these texts, but he will add his own additions, for example, diagrams of the working of the eye. Likewise, in the same with medicine, because there were many, particularly many Christian physicians at that time. Astronomy was a subject that also flourished. Bear in mind, this was a time long before telescopes. But they took astronomy a lot further than the ancient Greeks. They started with the great classic textbook from ancient Greece written by Ptolemy called the Almagest. If anyone wanted to get into scholarship, the first thing they did was read translations of the Almagest, translations of the work of Aristotle, translations of Euclid's Elements, the great book on geometry. And they built observatories, and they carried out measurements more accurately than the Greeks had done. They were much more pragmatic in terms of putting an emphasis on empirical science and experimentation than the Greeks had been. But just to give you an example of the diversity of backgrounds, I've gone through and listed just a few of the very early scholars. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, I mentioned. He was an Nestorian Christian physician and a great translator. Sanad ibn Ali al-Yahudi he was a Muslim astronomer, son of a Jewish astrologer in Baghdad. He's famous for having built the very first observatory in Baghdad. Ali ibn Sahal was a very famous Jewish physician who also translated texts. Sahal al-Tabari was an astronomer, Jewish astronomer and physician. He was the person who first translated Ptolemy's great book on astronomy. The Almagest was basically a collection of everything the ancient Greeks knew about the cosmos. So it was a very, very important text. And there'd been many, sort of, not just one translation, because these scholars would translate it and then someone else would come along and realize that they could make a better translation once they understood something more. But Al-Tabari was probably the first translation of Ptolemy's Almagest. And then Thabit ibn Qurra, again, 9th century, he was a pagan mathematician, and he translated texts from Syriac into Arabic. All these scholars were able to work freely. There didn't seem to be an issue. I think certainly during the Abbasid period, if you weren't a Muslim, non-Muslim communities had to pay higher taxes. As far as I can tell, that's the only reason. Whether there were those who converted into Islam for pragmatic reasons or for spiritual reasons, I've no idea. But certainly, it was a love of text, a love of knowledge, a love of scholarship that drove many of these early scholars. There are some who we now know that are famous in even today, certainly among historians of science. Chief among them was a Persian by the name of Al-Khawarizmi, who worked in Baghdad in the House of Wisdom, and he's regarded as the father of algebra, mainly because he wrote a famous text, the title of which was Kitab al-Jabr, the Book of Completion. So the title of the book, Al-Jabr, is what gives us the English word algebra. Certainly the ancient Greeks had, even the ancient Babylonians were solving quadratic equations, but not really doing proper algebra, not running through the algorithm, the steps of algebra. When you have x's and y's and manipulate an equation to find right at the very end, therefore x equals 3, that's an algebraic derivation. That algorithm, the word algorithm, also comes from the Arabic. In fact, it comes from Al-Khawarizmi's name. The Latinized name of Al-Khawarizmi is algorithmus, which is where the word algorithm comes from. So certainly, we think of a whole field of mathematics like algebra having first originated in this period. It was clearly a lot more than simply taking the great texts of the ancient Greeks, translating them into Arabic, and then when Europe reawoke with the Renaissance, dusting them off and handing them back to a grateful Europe, saying, here you go, we've looked after them, we've translated them to Arabic, but you can have them back again and translate them back into Latin. No, a lot of original work was done in this period too. I wanted to say a few words about my favorite scholar of this period. If we think back who the greatest physicist, my area of science, greatest physicist in history, I'd regard Archimedes as the great physicist of ancient Greece. He was more of a physicist than a philosopher by today's definitions. A span of 2,000 years later, and we probably have the greatest physicist of all time. So a nice question is, well, who was the greatest physicist in that 2,000-year period in between Archimedes and Newton? And I would say it is this Arab physicist by the name of Ibn al-Haytham, Latinized name Al-Hazin. He wrote many influential texts. He didn't invent the camera obscura, but he certainly used it to carry out experiments. He was the first to prove that light moves in straight lines, for example. He was the first to explain correctly how vision works, that it's light entering our eyes, and he used geometry to mathematize the way we see the world, rather than light shining out from our eyes, which is what many of the ancient Greeks believed. He wrote a book called the Book of Optics, pretty much exactly 1,000 years ago. It was translated into Latin in the early 13th century and became hugely influential in Europe. It would certainly influence thinkers like Roger Bacon, as well as many Renaissance artists. It talked about perspective, and therefore artists, certainly in the Renaissance period, like Alberti and Ghiberti, were very influenced by the Latin translation of this Book of Optics. So much so that we tend to forget the influence of some of these scholars, but this is a frontispiece, sort of inside the front cover of a text from the 17th century, by someone by the name of Johannes Hevelius, in which he shows, in his view, it's a book about a description of the moon. Okay, so this is not long after telescopes are invented and astronomers are able to study the moon in more detail. In this book, Hevelius puts up the two greatest scholars, the two great astronomers in history, in his view. One, of course, is Galileo. And then Galileo is there on the right holding a telescope, and on the left is Al-Hazin Ibn al-Haytham, who developed the mathematics. He mathematized astronomy. Very often we talk about the scientific method and when that started, and usually you see in textbooks who traditionally we say, well, it started in the early 17th century. It was Galileo, it was Francis Bacon, it was René Descartes. But actually, there's an argument. I mean, admittedly, I'm biased because Ibn al-Haytham is my man. But there's an argument that Ibn al-Haytham was certainly doing what we would today call science, the scientific method. Here's a quote which I'll read out to you from his book of Optics. He said, "We should distinguish the properties of particulars and gather by induction what pertains to the eye to be uniform, unchanging, manifest, and not subject to doubt. After which we should ascend in our inquiring and reasoning, gradually orderly, criticizing premises, exercising caution in regard to conclusions, our aim in all that we make subject to inspection and review, being to employ justice, not to follow prejudice, and to take care in all that we judge and criticize, that we seek the truth and not be swayed by opinion." That's sort of how we do science today, coming up with a hypothesis, criticizing it, testing it against experiment, against observation, and if it's wrong, we have to ditch it to move on. So one can even argue that the scientific method itself began back then. Ibn al-Haytham lived, in the 10th, 11th centuries. Another scholar I just wanted to mention quickly, because I don't want to go on for much longer now, is of course the great Avicenna, Ibn Sina. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, which is very, very famous. But he was also regarded as the greatest philosopher of medieval times, the greatest philosopher since Aristotle. His work influenced later philosophers. An Andalusian philosopher, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, merging some of these scientific, rational views of the world with theological thinking. The great Jewish philosopher, Maimonides, the great Christian philosopher, Thomas Aquinas. All of them, philosophy can be a bit like science. It's a baton handed on from one generation, from one culture to another, advancing these ideas. One last thing I wanted to say is in astronomy. So we think of modern astronomy as having been born with Copernicus. Of course, Copernicus predates Galileo by a few decades. Galileo clearly was the first person to use a telescope to point up at the sky and study the cosmos. But Copernicus was the first person, so our history books tell us, who suggested that it's the Earth that goes around the sun, the heliocentric model of the cosmos, and not the sun around the Earth. But of course, we now know that there were many astronomers before Copernicus who also had suggested this, going all the way back to ancient Babylon and ancient and great Indian astronomers. They hadn't developed a proper theory of cosmology in the same way that Copernicus has, and so we should give him the credit that he's due. But a very interesting coda to the story is that the mathematics that Copernicus used. If you look at his text, De Revolutionibus, the great text that Copernicus wrote, in which we see this beautiful picture with Sol, the sun, in the middle, and the Earth, just another planet orbiting. The mathematics he used, he took from earlier scholars from the Islamic world, a Persian astronomer by the name of Al-Tusi, and far more obscurely, a Syrian astronomer by the name of Ibn Shatir. Now, this is a picture of the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. And inside this mosque, I took this photo. I didn't take this photo. I took this photo off the internet. I did take photos of the mosque when I was filming there for the BBC. But what was interesting was that we found in this tower, this minaret, out on a ledge is a sundial, which was quite obscured, covered in pigeon droppings and rather not very well known. That was a sundial built by this medieval Islamic scholar Ibn Shatir. He developed a lot of the mathematics that was then used by Copernicus. What is interesting was that Ibn Shatir's job wasn't as a great established and recognized astronomer, but rather the astronomer who worked at the mosque, who told the muezzin, who calls the people to prayer when it was time to pray. He was the person who would work out with his using his charts and tables with the month of Ramadan, the time of fasting, and so on. So here is another final example that I want to leave you with, that even a field of science like astronomy, in some sense, was driven by the needs of this new religion. Of course, it took on a life of its own, and many of these astronomers then realized they didn't just want to be telling the mosque when it was time to call to prayer. They wanted to understand the nature of the cosmos. And so science flourished. It got to it reached its zenith in the 11th, 12th centuries, and then gradually went into decline. I don't want to talk about how science in the Islamic world today. Maybe that's something will come up in our discussion. But I'll just leave you with this idea that people tend to think, well, of course, it all went into decline. Why did it? Was it because of a rejection of science and rationalism by religion? There were certainly theologians in the Islamic world who were critical of science. Al-Ghazali is a particular example of that. But the truth is that science continued to flourish in the Islamic world. It just at a lower pace. The great Abbasid Empire was fragmenting into smaller kingdoms and dynasties, and at the same time, of course, Europe is emerging from its slumber with money. Why do these great dynasties and great golden ages happen? Because there's money behind it, right? The golden age of Athens, the Renaissance in Europe, the Abbasid period shone brightly for a few centuries, and then its light dimmed. But it left us with this legacy of science that's part of a continuum of how we understand the world that started from the ancient Greeks and continues to this day. As I say, scientific advancement is a baton that's handed from one era to another. Sometimes we repeat things that have been done before, but very often texts are translated, ideas are developed, and it doesn't sort of matter what your spiritual or religious belief is. They go hand in hand. And I will stop there and stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Absolutely fascinating. And we're going to come back to you with questions a little later. And now we welcome Keith Ward. Keith has so many titles and honours that they're impossible to summarise. He is an ordained priest in the Church of England and canon of Christ Church, Oxford, a fellow of the British Academy, and for over 12 years, he was Regius Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford. He's a philosopher and theologian, an expert in comparative religion, and has written extensively about the relationship between religion and modern science. And running through his vast body of work is the theme of looking at the many diverse ways in which humans have sought spiritual truth and what the different paths have to offer us today. His recent book is Adventures in Belief: How I Discovered the Meaning of Life, the Universe, and Everything Possibly. Who better than Keith Ward to deal with the same question that Jim addressed, but from a Christian perspective? So Keith, can we hear your 25-minute talk titled, How Did Key Ideas in Christian Thought Ultimately Prove Critical to the Birth of Science? Keith.
Well, it was very good to hear Jim speaking about the importance of Islamic science when Europe was, in fact, going through a bit of a dark age. And it was fascinating and important to know that Islam contributed so much to the birth of science. I want to start from where he left off, really. Jim mentioned Thomas Aquinas, and it's true that the works of the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, came through Arabic translations into Latin. That's quite important. And Aquinas is well known in Christian theology as a person who took the works of Aristotle, who wrote a book, more than one, on physics, and he used that as a way to expound Christian doctrine. Some people think he sort of squeezed it a bit to make it fit, but he did use Aristotle a lot. And Europe did learn from both the ancient Greeks and from Muslim thinkers what science was about, and that mathematics and astronomy were both very important parts of it. But actually, modern European science, which became more or less modern science, came about when Aquinas was overthrown as an authority in physics anyway, and Aristotle was dispensed with. So there's a very interesting story of why Aristotle was dispensed with. To put it in a nutshell, it's because Aristotle believed in two things that most modern scientists now don't believe in. One was that there are essential natures of things. The forms that Plato and Aristotle both talked about. Things have essential natures, and these natures are unchanging. So evolution doesn't fit that very well. And also the thought that everything had a final cause. There wasn't only an efficient cause, there was a final cause, a reason for which things were the way they were, what they were trying to aim at. So stones were trying to get to the center of the earth because that's where they wanted to be. Well, those were overturned really by the rise of European science. And in particular, I would want to pick on the name of Johannes Kepler. And Kepler was someone who, this was in 1571, he was born, and he completed and corrected and expanded Copernicus's view of the sun being at the center of the universe, and Kepler was able to plot the paths of the planets and discover or invent the laws of planetary motion. And he was a Lutheran, and I would like to quote one of the things he said about his use of science, and it was this: the laws of nature are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his image, so that we could share in his own thoughts. Now, the religious thinking behind that is very clear, and it was very important indeed for Kepler. He was relying on a text from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, text in Genesis, that humans are made in the image of God. There's been a lot of debate about what was meant, but it's pretty clear that it wasn't a physical image because God had no physical form. And so it was something to do with the mind, with a mental image in some way. And so Kepler takes it, and I think many people would still take it, that humans are special, are unique in the extent to which they can think abstractly and formulate hypotheses and think about moral questions as well. So their capacities are mental capacities, and they image the mind of God. So this was a quest for people like Kepler of understanding more about God, was to understand the world that God had made. And so the first idea that I want to suggest as an idea which proved critical to the birth of science in its modern form is the idea that there is a rational creator of the universe. As Newton was going to go on to say in his Principia Mathematica, well, the reason that Newton thought there were laws of nature which were probably inviolable and absolute, unless God, of course, changed them, those laws of nature were in fact just what a rational creator of the universe, who was a very good mathematician, would have done. It was as though Newton said, well, if I'd been making a universe, these are the laws I would have, and lo and behold, there they were God's laws. And for Newton, that was very important. In fact, Newton was a very, very devout Christian, although a heretical one, technically speaking. He was actually a Unitarian. They didn't have that name in those days, but he never told anybody about this because he was a fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge, and he thought that would be a bad move to say he wasn't a believer in the Trinity. But that was because he actually didn't think the Trinity was in the Bible, so they were for a religious reason. The important thing was he did think God was the great mathematician, that he was rational. And this was backed up by a text in the New Testament. The first sentence of St. John's Gospel in the beginning was the word, which is the logos, which is wisdom or reason or intellect. So the ideas that were working here, and they developed very slowly throughout Judaism and then consequently Islam and Christianity, were that, well, there weren't many gods who were in competition with one another. So the universe wasn't an anarchy or a chaos. There was just one God. So the universe was likely to be unified in some way. The same laws would operate everywhere in it. And also, it was rational. It could be understood by logic and reason. So they were very important ideas, and they did, in Kepler's case, and in most people at that time's case, derive from the belief that there was one rational creator of the universe. So whether or not we need to go on having that belief is another question. But if you're asking what ideas were really important, well, the idea of a rational God was very important. And then part of that was, well, God is not only rational. Suppose you ask the question, why would God create a universe? And some people might say, well, how on earth do we know? But actually, people like Kepler and Newton had a reason. The reason for creating a universe was that it brought into being some good things, some intrinsically good things, which wouldn't otherwise exist. Like, for example, listening to a great piece of music, or painting a great work of art, or just enjoying a beautiful landscape. I mean, these things are of intrinsic value. If you say, why do we like them? Well, certainly if you believed in anything like God, or if you weren't somebody who just said, it just means it's a matter of pure taste and nothing else, you might say these are intrinsically valued. There are some things that are worth existing. So if that's true, and if some of those things worth existing could only exist in a created universe, that's a good reason for having a universe. And here the view, which is not just Christian, but I think it is centrally Christian and was important to them, was that God is love. That's a sentence in the New Testament. God is love, agape, which is self-giving love. And of course, if God is love, then whatever God creates must make love possible. So there must be other minds, other consciousnesses between which love can exist, because love must be interpersonal, it must be interrelational. You can't love a picture, that's true, that's one kind of love. But agape love, self-giving love, is relation between persons which is cooperative and compassionate, and which gives us some of the most intrinsically worthwhile experiences we can have. So this would be a reason. So the universe is not only mathematically beautiful, it is actually beautifully beautiful. You can appreciate it and love it. And it makes possible personal relationships, which also bring about values which otherwise couldn't exist. Now, science is important here, because if you ask the question, what does science basically take for granted or assume? Well, one is that things don't happen for no reason at all. Causality reigns supreme. Every event has a cause. If you find one without a cause, you have to find a cause for that, as in quantum physics, but we won't go there. I will leave that to Jim. But you can't really have things without any cause at all. They can't be completely random. That's a very basic faith. You just say, well, science wouldn't exist without that. So causality is important. Beauty, is that important? Well, it seems it is, because when you're doing mathematics, you're concerned, if you got beyond the early stages, with the beauty of the things you are discovering. I remember Andrew Wiles, the mathematician who discovered the solution of Fermat's last theorem. When he described this on television, he burst into tears. Because it was such a beautiful idea. Well, of course, he thought of it, that was part of it, but it was just beautiful intrinsically as well. So beauty is very important. I think Paul Dirac, a mathematician in Cambridge, used to say, I thought of these equations because they are the most beautiful. Well, beauty or mathematical elegance, yes, that's important. And relationship, is that important in science? Yes, it is, because science can only exist when people trust each other. and you assume they're telling the truth. They're not making up things. We know some of them do, but on the whole, scientists have to say, well, this is established, and they can discuss it and criticize one another. They're personal relationships. And I suppose you want to say, well, in this way, science has very deep moral substandards, basic principles. So one of them is understanding the rationality of the universe. Another is understanding and appreciating the beauty of the universe. And another one is actually using your understanding of nature to produce human good. And I think science has always, at its best, had the view that we're doing this in medicine, for example, in order to improve the quality of human life. So these things are moral demands. And I think in science, you might feel, well, I just have to pursue truth, even if it's difficult. And even if everyone loves my theories, if I think they're true, I try and show them they're true and keep working at it. So truth becomes a very important value. I remember Steven Weinberg saying it, very famous statement really, the more I understand the universe, the less I think it has any meaning. It's slightly garbled view of what he actually said. But that always struck me as an extraordinary thing for him to say, because he found intrinsic value in understanding the universe. And that was the point. That was the whole point of the thing. But he had other reasons for being skeptical. And of course, that makes the point that the area of God gets mixed up with all sorts of, did you think this happened in history? And did you think that happened? So as Einstein used to say, the Bible is a whole load of legends and stories. But at the same time, Einstein was not averse to saying there is an intelligence, a mind which lies behind the universe. Just to quote Freeman Dyson, a very well-known, recently dead, I think, physicist, who said to me, this is Dyson, a very good physicist indeed, who said to me, to worship God means to recognize that mind and intelligence are woven into the fabric of the universe. So there's the sense that if there was a rational God who created the universe, then this universe would have a point. The point would be things which are of intrinsic value, which become moral demands upon human beings. And it becomes a human task to seek those values at almost any cost, right? To seek the understanding of how things are, to seek to appreciate the beauty of things, and to seek to better human life and use your understanding to change, to improve the universe. Of course, in the early days of European science, 17th century, 18th century, the idea of improving the universe was a rather controversial one, because some people might have said, well, if God made the universe, how could it be improved? I mean, he must have made the best possible universe. Actually, that's not the case. And it is a continuing problem why it's not the case, which I can't go into. That's a good excuse. Because I don't have time, but you have to say, well, it is the case that the universe can be improved, and one of the intrinsic values that this world brings about is the fact that we can improve things. That's actually a value. There's a great value in learning something, in not understanding it, and then coming to understand it, in not being able to know how to cope with a virus and then finding out how to do it. There's a great value in discovery, in exploration, in knowing, and in learning. So this is the sort of universe in which that is a constant of human endeavor. So the universe can be improved. And I suppose if a Christian says we ought to imitate God, because we love God, we ought to love God. That means imitate God. And if God was shown in Jesus, I would say not only in Jesus, but of course, as a Christian minister, I would say it was supremely shown in Jesus. Agape love is really a primary value. And if that's true, then you're going to say, what did Jesus do? He healed, he reconciled, he forgave. So if you're going to follow Jesus, you're going to say, that's what I should be doing. I should be healing things which are hurtful and reconciling things which cause violence. And that means the universe cannot be perfect. And a universe in which you can show agapistic love can't be a perfect universe, because that love would then have very little point. There'd be nowhere for compassion. All right. I'm not justifying the ways of God. I'm just saying, if you were a Christian, and I'm thinking about people like Newton and later on other Christians who followed their way of thinking about the creation, would have said, well, an implication of this is that looking at Jesus as an image of God, that gives you the idea that we should be using science to heal. And we could, in fact, improve the universe. So I think that's how they answered the objection that a universe made by God couldn't be improved. Then again, still thinking about the nature of God as it's not only revealed in Christianity, but I think it is revealed, and these people happened to be Christian. Interestingly, they happened, not all of them by any means, but major ones like Newton and many major physicists were actually Protestant Christians. Now, the point of that is not that there's something good about Protestantism. The point is they were allowed to be unorthodox. So they were allowed to be heretics. There's something important about that, I think, when you're looking at religion and science. If you're going to be very, very orthodox, you're probably thinking, well, the past was better than the present, and things are just getting worse, and we must just believe what was said a long time ago. If you're able to be free thinking about it, you might say, no, maybe God is a creator. Maybe God is doing new things. Maybe we ought to imitate God by also being creative. And why should we obey what somebody like Aquinas or Aristotle said when they were so often wrong? Let's be new and original. And that went with that sort of Protestant thinking, even though Newton kept a bit quiet about it, about his unorthodoxy. It is true that I think the great creative scientists may accept religious beliefs, but they'll always give a little spin and have a view of their own, which is just a little bit unorthodox. I think that's perfectly good, because I happen to be that way myself. Not a good scientist, but unorthodox anyway. So that sort of religious approach of, yes, faith and trust in the rationality and morality and the goodness of being, that's important, but also that we don't understand it. The truth is yet to be found. We're looking for it. We can have new ideas and learn about it. Another thing that I'd like to say about this, of course, still thinking about the idea of God, but looking now for a moment just at a specific Christian doctrine. Again, I wouldn't limit it to Christianity, but it's centrally and distinctively Christian, is the incarnation, is the idea that one person could be a perfect image of the nature of the Creator. Now, for me, that's not too difficult an idea, because if the nature of the Creator is agapistic love, then if that's what Jesus showed, he was an image in a human being of the nature of God. So people like me would certainly say, yes, of course, Jesus was human. He was certainly, definitely human. But he became, and after his death, he definitely became, even more importantly, an image of the agapistic love and the healing and reconciling life that the disciples would be expected to live. Also, the incarnation would show, I think, definitively that human life was, in a sense, sacred, that because, as it were, the Creator had imaged the created being in a human life, there was something about human life which should not ever be frustrated or denied or destroyed. So the dignity and reverence that we owe to humans is centrally inspired by the idea of incarnation. So again, there's an idea important to the sort of science which puts human dignity and life and human welfare first. And that's quite important, because just as religion can be perverse and destructive, so can science. Just think of the H-bomb and etc. And you say, well, it's important that science should be gained, knowledge should be gained and used in morally acceptable ways, and those are ways which care for the welfare of human life. We could go on to say more than human life, of course, welfare of all life, perhaps. And there is perhaps the last thing I would say about these Christian ideas, that it was in the old, as we in England would say, Byzantine Empire. I think in the States you'd probably say Byzantine, so we just used it that. In that old Greek empire, of course, there was very definitely a very important Christian doctrine, which many Christians have lost sight of now, which was called theosis, becoming divine. And you find this in the letters in the New Testament to the Colossians and the Ephesians, where it says the mystery revealed in Christ was that all things, and the word in Greek is tota panta, absolutely everything, all things in heaven, that's angels, I suppose, and on earth, will be united in Christ. Now, again, what that means, it might be discussed for a very long time, but it certainly means that all things, everything will be united in a personal reality. Now, I don't think the Christ here is Jesus, not the man Jesus. It is that wisdom of God, the eternal cosmic Christ, which was manifested and expressed in Jesus. So all things will be united and perfected. There will be a new heaven and a new earth in a mental, spiritual reality of God. What does that mean for the way science is done? Well, it does mean something. It means don't never give up hope. Something good will come out of the mess that this world is. And scientists may do some things and they may all go wrong, but you still shouldn't give up hope, because you are contributing to intrinsically good states, the best possible perhaps in the circumstances. And at the end of this, there may be something glorious when we realize the true value and destiny of human life. So that notion of theosis is a note of hope in a world which so often faces despair. And I think
we've come to the end of your...
Come to the end.
And that was wonderful. And I know there's going to be so many questions. So I just want to thank you, Keith Ward. And before Keith, Jim Al-Khalili. And now we're joined by Hava Tirosh-Samuelson, an expert in Jewish thought, and physicist Paul Davies, whose work deals with the deep meaning of the universe and the place in it of life. But first, Hava, do you have any comments as to how the Jewish perspective fits into the development of science?
Yeah, thank you very much for including a Jewish voice in this conversation. So far, we've heard about the contribution of Islam to the birth of modern science, and I will say a few words. I'll try to do it rather quickly and therefore superficially, but I will try to say something about the Jewish contribution. So kind of the interesting thing is that Jews are not among the list of people who are known when we talk about the modern, the birth of modern science. So if the list includes Kepler or Galileo or Boyle or Newton, you're not going to know the name of Jews that were relevant to the story. And nonetheless, I do believe that Jews are very important to the story. But in order to make that case, I have to provide a little bit more information that will make sense of that. So I'm going to do it in a way that combines elements from Professor Khalili's approach as well as from Professor Ward's approach. Professor Khalili is an historian of science, and I will likewise speak in the same vein. I will emphasize continuity over discontinuity. I'm going to pay attention to social conditions and the institutions that make science possible, the production of science possible, and I will try to figure out kind of the impact of scientific activities on the broader cultural context of Jewish society. But because I'm an intellectual historian, I do pay attention to philosophy and theology. And in that regard, I'm somewhat close to the questions and the approaches that are represented by Professor Ward, especially in his wonderful book, Pascal's Fire, Scientific Faith and Religious Understanding. And there, Professor Ward reminds us that all the people who produced science, at least in the early modern period, were religious people. And he puts it very nicely when he says that they regarded the study of nature, and now I quote, as spiritual enterprise in their attempt to gain deeper understanding of the wisdom of God. And we just heard precisely that kind of approach. He singled out, in one of the chapters, he singles out Newton, for whom, again, I quote, the laws of nature demonstrate the presence and power of one supreme God and immense wisdom, intelligence, and spiritual purpose. So I'm mentioning Newton because if we are to understand Newton, we have to pay attention to Kabbalah, to the Jewish mystical tradition. And as Matt Goldish, a very important historian of science and the relationship between Kabbalah and Newton, Goldish has said that Kabbalah is more than just marginal in the corpus of Isaac Newton, and he shows the importance of alchemy and astrology and magic in how Newton thought about what modern science really was about. So I'll have to say a little bit more about that. But what's the bottom line about Jews? Jews always acted as cultural intermediaries. They were transmitters of knowledge, and they did it primarily as translators. Some of them were quite good astronomers, especially Gersonides in Provence in the 14th century. Some of them were excellent mathematicians. But on the whole, science was marginal in Jewish community. Why? Because it was not part of the curriculum of the Jewish higher learning. So if you're going to study science, how are you going to do it? You're going to do it in private. You're going to do it primarily by writing books, by copying books, by translating books. And if you're very good, you're going to be benefiting from some kind of royal patronage, or sometimes even papal patronage or imperial patronage. The question that I would like to raise for our consideration is whether science challenge some Jewish beliefs. And here it depends, of course, who you're going to ask. So if you're going to ask the philosophers, they're going to say, philosophers especially like Moses Maimonides, the answer would be no. Actually, Maimonides argues that you need to have science, you depend on scientific knowledge in order to understand how the natural world works. So science doesn't challenge religious belief. Rather, science enhances and deepens religious commitment because science facilitates understanding of God through the understanding of God's created world. And I think that's Maimonides' position. And I believe that's basically what we just heard from Professor Ward. That's exactly that kind of position. So let me say a few words about Maimonides just to show you how complex the story is. If you know your Aristotle, you remember that Aristotle believed that the world is eternal. It always was, always will be. Well, Judaism believes in creation. So did Aristotle's view, and the Jews who bought into Aristotle's view, do they challenge their own religious belief system? That's a very complicated question that perplexed the Jews, and Maimonides composed the Guide of the Perplexed in order to resolve this issue. But this particular book is the most perplexing book probably ever written, because it's written as a kind of a puzzle. It's a puzzle that cannot be resolved in one way. There are many, many solutions to the puzzle, and it's a highly enigmatic book that really encourages Jews to study further. If you ask me kind of what was the intent of writing a very perplexing book, my answer would be to encourage us to engage in the work of interpretation, of thinking through about Judaism, primarily about revealed scripture from the perspective of science. And science in the Middle Ages meant Aristotelian science. And that's basically what Maimonides did. So Maimonides did not write a commentary on the Bible. He didn't explain to Jews how to read verse by verse, but he gave them a way to think about it. And he told them, if you want to know how God created the world, you've got to read Aristotle's Meteorology. Indeed, the same person translated Maimonides' God of the Perplexed, which was written in Judeo-Arabic. He translated it into Hebrew. The same person, that's Shmuel ibn Tibbon, also translated Aristotle's Meteorology. So Maimonides is telling Jews, you've got a key that enables you to open up the mysteries of the Torah as well as the mystery of the natural world, but you have to keep your reason constantly at the forefront of the enterprise, because sometimes Aristotle is wrong, or Aristotle can only be right about certain part of reality, but not other parts of realities. He's okay about the sublunar world, but not okay about basically what we would call astronomy. So there are some problems here. And he, as a philosopher, can say, I can take Aristotle to the extent that Aristotle is right, Aristotle is correct, or I can prove that what Aristotle is saying is the case. So the students of Maimonides wrote commentaries on his books, and they taught Jews how to read Torah through a new lens, through a philosophic lens, or a particular scientific lens. But that doesn't mean that everybody joined forces. A lot of people, we're going to call them Kabbalists. I'm going to refer to them as Kabbalists. They did not like that approach, that scientific philosophic approach to the biblical text. And what they actually suggested, that in order to know what Scripture says, you have to receive certain body of knowledge. You don't have to read Aristotle, but you have to have access to a particular tradition of interpretation. Kabbalah literally means tradition. You need to have access to that body of knowledge, and then you're going to be able to interpret the biblical text. What's interesting about that body of knowledge, that it's very closely related to astrology, to talismanic and astral magic, and to a whole new view that we in the West call the occult view. Basically, the idea of the occult means that there are hidden properties that you can, a particular person who knows, can unpack those properties, can unleash their power. They can really make sense of that power and use that power in the world. And that approach is precisely what Kabbalah represents. The difficult thing about Kabbalah is that Kabbalah is all about language, as much as magic is all about language. So basically, the Kabbalist position is that the world was created by language. God spoke and brought the world into existence. And what we need to know, and of course, he did it in Hebrew. So the building blocks, so to speak, of this edifice we call the world are, according to the Kabbalists, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And you need to know a very complex system, a highly symbolic system, in order to unpack the meaning of Torah. And if you do that, you also unpack the structure and the interrelationship of the natural world. The interesting thing historically is that view became very influential in the Renaissance, especially because you have people like Marsilio Ficino or people like Pico della Mirandola who had access to this knowledge. Why? Because they had Jewish teachers. So Pico's teacher was Yohanan Alemano, a very interesting person who studied Kabbalah and magic and astrology. And that became very, very important in the origins of modern science. So my point is that we need to think about those areas which we don't normally associate with science, such as magic, such as astrology, and in order to figure out how modern science came into being. So the one point I will say about language is that language and its association with magic makes sense if we keep in mind that it's all about power. So if you know the structure of the word and you know the inherent occult properties, then you can impact the world. So if you ask yourself, how did it all come about? It didn't come just from knowledge of the general principles, which is what natural philosophy a la Aristotle gives us, but rather a much more particularized kind of knowledge, which the Kabbalist suggested to us. So it's a very complicated story, but I will suggest that in the 16th century and 17th centuries, we have to pay a lot of attention to those traditions. If you know something about the Hermetic tradition that is associated with Hermes, an ancient god, then you will see how it all fits together. So to conclude, I would say that while Jews did not take the lead in modern science, they contributed to the emergence of modern science in the following way. First, they had a long tradition that incorporated science or natural philosophy into the interpretation of the biblical text. Second, the Kabbalists among them were engaged in astromagic, astrology, and alchemy that shifted the attitude toward nature from bookish learning to hands-on knowledge, to practical knowledge. And third, Kabbalah in particular not only endowed the study of nature with religious meaning, it also inaugurated the connection between knowledge and power to change nature. So we all know the famous formula, knowledge is power, scientia potestas est, that's associated with Francis Bacon, who is considered one of the fathers of modern science. And what that means is the capacity to do. But the deeds are magical in the sense that they aspire to manipulate nature at its foundation. What's the moral of the story? That modern science was not a break with the immediate past, but really it's a story of continuity. Second, I would say that science could not be separated from either philosophy or religion, and the boundaries between science and what is not science is very fluid and very fuzzy in this early modern period. Third, while modern science emerged in Western Europe, it was not an exclusively Christian story. Rather, it was a story in which Muslims and Jews played supportive role that began several centuries before the emergence of modern science. And finally, the birth of modern science is neither linear nor monochromatic, but rather it's a very convoluted story in which diverse intellectual traditions, Aristotelianism, Platonism, Neoplatonism, Stoicism, Hermeticism, are all intertwined. So the bottom line is that in the world that gave us modern science, there was no conflict between science and religion, and there was no separation between science and philosophy. And perhaps this is the lesson that the conversations on ethics, religion, and science, or CORES for short, is precisely what it seeks to give to all of us. So thank you all for joining us. And I guess now we can begin the questions.
Thank you, Hava. That was terrific. Yes, I
you
so much. And, the idea that's coming out quite strongly from everyone is that science deepens religious belief, maybe still deepens religious belief. So would anyone like to comment? Paul, you haven't spoken yet. Would you like to go first?
Yes, you're quite right, Pauline. That really was a treat. And I've been scribbling notes. I could talk for hours, and I know you'll cut me off long before that. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Keith said, and then we can maybe have a further discussion, because I have myself stressed the importance that this idea of monotheism, that there is a supreme lawgiver who's ordered the universe in a rational way with fixed laws, is the very foundation of science. Most of my scientific colleagues would call themselves atheists, but they accept as a matter of belief that not only is the world ordered in this rational way, but we human beings can come to understand it as both rational and intelligible. And this is really a theological position. there's one other aspect I wanted to throw in, which I've thought a lot about in recent years, which is that in monotheism, there is a belief that God cannot be changed by the nature of the world, but the world depends utterly for its existence and its nature on God. There's this asymmetry. The world doesn't change God, God supports the world. And that asymmetry is directly reflected in the way physicists and most scientists accept that the laws are fixed, and whatever happens in the universe, however violent the phenomena, collapse of objects to black holes and so on, the laws are impervious to that. So just in recent years, some scientists have dabbled with the idea that maybe we should move beyond that and have the notion of laws being flexible, but that's still regarded as heretical. So 300 years into science, into the scientific project, this belief in fixed laws, rational mathematical relationships that humans can come to understand is the very foundation of science. And I think there's no doubt that is a theological position. I also wanted to throw in something, and I'll let the others comment on this. The one thing that Judaism did, and it was taken up by both Christianity and Islam, is the notion of unidirectional time, that there is a cosmic story to tell, a beginning, a creation, if you like, and then a sequence of unfolding events, and then some sort of final destiny. And that idea of linear time, again, has been imported into science. We have this notion of the Big Bang and the rise of complexity in the universe and some future that we can all talk about and speculate about. But that unidirectional time is not found in most other cultures, which emphasizes more cyclicity. So that was a really important point. Two major points: unidirectional time and this rational, intelligible, fixed set of laws. These are the important things. I threw in some other comment about extraterrestrial life. We could talk about that if there were time. But if you want me to turn this little rambling diatribe into a question, it would be just to ask Keith. He pointed out how Protestantism was more tolerant of heretical thought. We all think of the Catholic Church and Galileo and the attempt to sort of suppress what he was saying. But I think the version we get is a little bit simplistic, isn't that right, Keith? And that really the Catholic Church wasn't actually anti-science. It was really more politics and personalities playing out. Could you just say a few words about that?
Oh, well, that's absolutely true. And of course, you mentioned the Big Bang, and as we know, it was Lemaitre, a Catholic priest, who actually thought of that idea. And even Einstein thought it was a ludicrous idea, but became converted to it. And Catholics have, Mendel is very important in genetics. So Galileo himself always remained a believing Catholic, I'm sure. And Copernicus was a canon of Krakow Cathedral. So Catholics were doing things. I think my only point was that probably people like Newton were a bit freer to say things that were a little bit odd at the time, because nobody was going to burn them at the stake, which was a point. But yeah. So
I have heard it conjectured, though, that if it wasn't for this resistance of the establishment, science might have just been yet another weird branch of thought, and nobody would have taken it too seriously. But because they had to dig in and defend their corner, it perhaps gave science the oxygen of publicity in those early days, as Margaret Thatcher might have expressed it, and actually contributed to the rise of science, because it had to be battle tested against this skeptical establishment.
That could well be true, because I think in the history of the Catholic Church, if you're persecuted in one generation, you become a saint in the next. That was true of Aquinas. His teachings were forbidden in Paris, and yet he became a saint. So, attacked the authority, and you lost them.
Yeah. I'd like to hear from the other two about the nature of time.
Before you say that, Paul, can I just say to the audience, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try and address them. So I'm sorry, Paul, so I interrupted you. So
Well, I was just wondering whether Jim and Harbour might have something to say about this critical thing of unidirectional time, which is so important in science. We think of linear time, and yet this was a great break from so many cultures, the idea that the universe began at a fixed moment in the past and is unfolding according to some sort of sequence where there's a cosmic story to tell. And modern cosmology, you know, we talk about the universe and states of the universe, and you write books about the universe. There is a thing called the universe, which has a narrative that you can articulate. And that's actually a very bold idea. It's not a sort of a wheel of fortune, things go around and come around and the different competing influences and so on. So would the others like to comment on the importance of this unidirectional cosmic narrative?
Harbour, did you want to go?
No, the only thing that comes to my mind is that the Jewish position or the Judaic position is an attempt to emphasize freedom. So I would connect what you're talking about in terms of where there is a beginning and an end, but it's always open-ended. And because the future is always open-ended, there is an inherent hopefulness, I think, in the Jewish position. Because we don't know, in that sense, by the way, that's why one reason why Maimonides opposed astrology, why he thought that astrology is not a science, it's a bad science. However, I should say that Gersonides, who was even a better scientist than Maimonides, did take astrology seriously. But in any way, if I think what's the merit of this idea, I think it's the open-endedness of the future and hence hope. Whereas if you have internal return, a kind of an Nietzschean understanding, right, of the time, everything is what it always was, then there's very little room for creativity and for openness and for hope. That would be my take. But it's not a scientific response, it's more like a theological response.
I would say, I mean, in response to your comment, Paul, of course, I mean, to let people know, Paul and I are part of a research project looking precisely into the direction of time and why it points from past to future and not in the other direction. So, you know, there's some serious, we're given research funding to actually think about and do research into this, which is great fun. But I think a lot of people would argue aspects of modern cosmology, you know, the beginning of the universe and whether it had a beginning and whether we are one of many parallel worlds, how the universe will end. Because a lot of aspects of cosmology, I think, don't fall into what we might call traditional empirical science, because it's very difficult to test some of these ideas. Firstly, you know, there's only one universe, so what do you compare it with that we're aware of? But also, it's very difficult to carry out an experiment to see how the universe will end or how it started. And they may argue that cosmology is really not so different from theology. We'd like to think that in science it's empirical and we have to test things. But there are ideas in cosmology. You know, Roger Penrose, Nobel Prize winner, who worked a lot with Stephen Hawking, argues and has done and still does the idea that the universe may well be cyclic, that our universe was born in a big bang that came from a previous generation universe. To some extent, these ideas are not part of the mainstream now because we thought it maybe our universe can form in a big bang and grow and then recollapse again in a big crunch. Then maybe that big crunch becomes the big bang for a next generation. We now believe there is empirical evidence to suggest the universe is very unlikely to recollapse on itself, but it'll just carry on expanding forever. So there are still a lot of questions in cosmology. Science shouldn't be so arrogant as to think that we have dismissed and left behind some of these old, outdated ideas. I wanted to make a quick comment on something very interesting that Harbour said about Maimonides' teaching that science and rational thinking should guide us in better understanding our faith, our religious beliefs. I found that very interesting, particularly when I was filming for the BBC and my Science and Islam series, because I know you guys may get it as well, but I will get emails from people, particularly from devout Muslims, although I think this is not restricted to just Muslim people, who will say, you know, why the Quran tells us, it's told us how the Big Bang happened. Quantum mechanics is all there in the Quran. It's all in the Word of God, and anything that's worth knowing should be there. Therefore, why would you need to go and study science? You know, it's all there in your holy book. That wasn't the attitude, certainly in the medieval Islamic period. Those early scholars in Islam were certainly well aware that, you know, God gave us brains. Let's go and use them, and better understand the words in the Quran rather than trying to interpret them, you know, in a vacuum. And what was interesting, and I say, I'm not a religious person myself, but it was interesting actually interviewing imams in a madrasa, a religious school in Iran, who were very keen to point out that the Quran is not a medical textbook. It's not a book on mathematics or astronomy. It's a book that tells 1 billion Muslims how to lead their lives. And I found that very refreshing, that, you know, there are sensible thinkers who understand that you can't get all the truths from your holy book simply because you wouldn't understand what those words might mean. Use your brain to go and find out how the world is, and that might help you understand that book a bit better. So it's interesting that was something that Maimonides was stressed.
Well, in all honesty or frankness, there were Jews who said what some of those devout Muslims said. So they said,
sure.
oh, everything is in the Torah. We don't need to study science. The Torah is all, especially if you compare Maimonides to another person a few decades afterwards. That's Nachmanides. That's Moses ben Nachman, who is known as Nachmanides, a very important Kabbalist himself. More or less, that was his position. But Maimonides was indeed a very refreshing scholar, to use your word. But also, he taught us not to read the biblical text literally. And that's a key difference, maybe, between the Muslim and the Jewish approaches. The whole midrashic tradition, I think, in Judaism is inherently non-literalist, whereas both in Islam and I would have to say also in Christianity, I find that the lure of literalism is always there. Whereas Maimonides is telling Jews that the literal meaning a lot of time ends you in idolatry or in heresy. It's just the wrong way of looking at it. For example, that God has a body. No, that to Maimonides is a heretical and idolatrous position. It's a total misunderstanding of what God is all about. So in that sense, Maimonides really was a very radical thinker, if you wish, or non-traditional thinker. But that doesn't mean that all Jews have accepted it. What Jews did accept from Maimonides is his legal, basically his jurisprudence. That was accepted even more than his philosophy. So we do need to keep in mind that he wasn't just a philosopher, wasn't just a physician. He was also a leading jurist. And when his jurisprudence was accepted as authoritative, then he became the most important thinker in Judaism, I would say. I don't know if it addresses, but I have a question for both Keith and Paul, because I think that both of you, and Keith, if I may use your first name, if that's okay with you.
Yeah,
I think that you refer, as I noted, you refer a lot of times to the studies of Paul Davies in your work. So my question is, could you explain to all of us the difference between naturalism and religious naturalism? It seems to me that you just to kind of lead you on a little bit, it seems either religious naturalism is contradiction in terms, or naturalism is impossible because all you have is religious naturalism. So I would like you to grapple with that a little bit.
Well, I would, but I'm sorry I sound like a philosopher, but what does naturalism mean? I'm not sure what it means. I mean, I would interpret it to mean, in terms of modern philosophy, the view that nothing but matter and space-time exists. Is that right?
Fair enough. Yeah.
And then, so I don't know what religious naturalism would be then, because unless you said religious language is just metaphor and it's not really about anything, you know. If you say God knows, you're not talking about a being which has knowledge, you're making an expletive. But I don't think you mean that. So I'm not sure what religious naturalism would be. You're not meaning literalism, are you?
No, not literalism.
No.
It seems that you cannot really think about nature without God, in your understanding.
I see.
If I hear you correctly, or if I read you correctly, it seems that's what you're saying, that you really cannot think, how shall I put it, in the most comprehensive manner without bringing God into the story. Every other thinking God without God would be incomplete, or maybe even wrong. So in that sense, I would look at that as religious naturalism.
Could I just throw in a comment then? Because most of my colleagues would say that they do look at the universe without thinking about God. And I think the point that I was trying to make is that they are adopting a conceptual framework which derives from monotheism. And that to that extent, we can't really embark on the scientific quest without this twin idea of that the universe is ordered in a rational and intelligible way, and has mathematical relationships that we humans can come to understand. And if you are religious, you might want to think, as Keith has mentioned, that humans are somehow created in God's image in the intellectual sense, but in a diminished sense, so that we struggle to understand the universe. We do our best. We've done extremely well. The scientific project has been immensely successful, but there's no guarantee it's ever going to be concluded. There's no obvious reason why the human mind will be able to grasp everything. I have a theory of everything. It's a very popular idea. Is there time, Pauline, for me to just ask one more question or pick up one more point that Keith made?
Well, if you do it quickly, because we can come back to it.
I'll state it, but we don't need to talk
questions.
About it.
That's what I was just about to do.
Well, let me just state it very quickly, because he said one of the great things about having a universe with free beings is that we can make it better. And it's easy to think of the way the world might be better, one more bottle of champagne or something. But physicists sometimes struggle with the idea that maybe we do live in the best of all possible worlds, but not in the everyday sense, but maybe in some mathematical sense. Maybe the laws of physics are in some sense optimal. And there's a lot of discussion about this. And I wrote a chapter in a book recently, Is the Universe a Botched Job? Pointing out the work that some people do, that no, we could tweak the laws of physics. If we could tweak the laws of physics, they might actually be better in the sense of more life encouraging or something like that. And so there are these abstract sense in which we can talk about, is this the best of all possible worlds?
Okay, let me go to the
put that idea out there.
A very just parts of Abdallah's question, and this is the last part, and he says, is it possible that during the golden age of the Islamic Empire there was a significant drive to advance scientific knowledge for military purposes, just as happens today? So could that be the case as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I focused. In fact, I was typing a response to Abdallah, but it's good. I talked about this new religion, the needs of the new religion, requiring advances and understanding in astronomy, and certainly in medicine as well. But yeah, I mean, this was a huge empire, and it was expanding its borders, and it was at war with the Christians in Europe. It was at war with armies in India and China, and any powerful empire, when it's at war, it needs to develop the technologies of warfare. Metallurgy, chemistry was something that was absolutely developed, and maybe that's yet another area of science that advance. I suspect not necessarily any differently from any other powerful empires. I'm sure the Roman Empire also knew how to make nasty weapons that would help them win wars. So it's probably not unique to Islam. But no, it should, that empire, I mean, there weren't so, just because the word Islam derives from the word peace doesn't mean they were handing out roses as they advanced and took over various other nations around them.
Thank you.
But
Keith, I want to tell the audience that because this conversation is so stimulating and exciting, you know, I think we'll probably go on till 2 o'clock, which is 10 minutes longer than we had advertised. So Keith, quick response, and I'll go to another question.
I was just going to say, maybe there's quite a lot of anti-scientific thought around in the world today, and that may be one of the factors that a lot of scientific work goes to the construction of more and more weapons and is producing technologies which seem to be harmful to the environment, that people are beginning to think that science is not something that can be ethically trusted. I just read a report in the papers today about genetics and Lord Winston saying that the new genetic laws proposed in England could actually be harmful in ways we can hardly imagine. So that fear of science, being able to do, you know, the Faustian fear, too much knowledge and control, is actually dangerous. Now, I don't think that's true, but it's an explanation of why science might come to be suspected and lose its authority in a society. I don't think it will in our society, but if certain people got into power, it would lose its authority, because you already hear people saying, politicians saying, we don't trust the experts. And that is perhaps a very dangerous position to be in, which is why science needs to be ethically oriented.
Actually, a question from me, is science inevitable, the development of science? You know, if the world started again, would we ever find science?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I've often wondered, you know, if an asteroid had hit the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, would the scientific method really have emerged? Because it does seem to depend so much on historical contingency. And the great contrast might be with China, where at the time of the birth of science in Europe, China was more advanced technically. And if you take something like lodestones, they knew about magnetism, but it took the genius of James Clerk Maxwell to put together the mathematical laws of electromagnetism. So we now have an understanding of how magnetism arises. And that came directly out of this notion that there is a set of mathematical laws which we don't see from casual observation, but you have to dig out by this intellectual endeavor that we call the scientific method. You can't get there by trial and error. So I wonder, and this comes up a lot about SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Would alien civilizations inevitably develop science and have radio telescopes and be trying to communicate? It's not obvious to me at all that you would ever stumble across this thing called science. We take it for granted because, you know, I'm a scientist, and my colleagues say, well, of course it works. I'm paid to do it. You know, that's my job. But when you stand back and think, we're dazzled by the ability of science to deliver so much, that it is such a peculiar thing. You stand at a blackboard and write strange squiggles, and then you go into a lab and do really weird things with matter. You'd never build the Large Hadron Collider on the basis of, well, let's put all this stuff together and see what happens. You have to have this underlying concept of these unifying laws of deep abstract mathematical relationships that connect everything together deep down. The world is not just a hodgepodge of phenomena and odds and ends. I'm talking too much. I better stop.
I'll just add to that, Paul, that I think I agree with you, actually, but for me, it's the scientific method that I wonder whether it was inevitable we'd stumble across. I think once we discovered the scientific method, the idea that, you know, you can test your ideas out, and if they're wrong, if they don't match with observation or an experiment, then you have to disband them and come up with something better, something different.
But you've got to believe that there is something out there to discover, that there are hidden mathematical relationships. You see, we don't see them. when you see an apple fall, you see a falling apple. But it took Newton's genius to connect the motion of the apple to the motion of the moon. I don't think any other animal on our planet has done that. And even though there are some very smart animals, and I wonder if it just takes certain cultural antecedents, certain contingencies, accidents of history, to stumble across the fact that yes, we can unlock the secrets of the universe because there is this mathematical subtext that we can decode. But you've got to look at the world in a very peculiar way. We take it for granted because we're doing it every day. That's what we're paid to do. But it's a very peculiar thing.
Yeah, the ancient Greeks didn't think that way. You know, as I think Hava said, you know, the ancient Greeks said the apple falls because it wants to get to where its natural place, to the center of the earth. They didn't talk about the inverse square law and so on. So, and they were very clever, but because they didn't, I think that was the point. Because they didn't think of a mathematical theory that governs gravity, they didn't feel there was any need for anything deeper than the fact that the apple falls because it wants to go to its natural position.
Right. I mean, how would you know that there are neutrinos in the world? You'd never get there by trial and error. We don't, I mean, their effects are so tiny. You have to have this sort of belief that there is an underlying mathematical scheme and a need in the equations for a particle with the properties of the neutrino. And then lo and behold, you find it, but you have to put a huge amount of effort to actually detect the things.
Okay, and another question, and this is really a question from Arjun, and he's asking about other faiths. So we've been concentrating on on monotheism, but what about the other great religions of the world, the Buddhism, Hinduism, and whatever? I know you're not experts in that particular area, but do you know anything about it, or is this just worthy of another discussion?
I just to say one comment. I remember giving a talk about cosmology, I think, and I talked about the Big Bang, and there was a young Sikh student in the front row, and I could see his face light up. And after he came and told me, he says, "This is exactly what we're taught in Sikhism, that the universe is born in a great ball of fire." And it's great that I now understand that modern science agrees with me. So he went away very, very happy.
There is, of course, a tradition in theoretical physics of appealing to Eastern philosophy, Eastern thought, Zen Buddhism, and so on, which seems to mesh quite well with concepts in quantum physics and particle physics. And I personally think some of that is a little bit overblown. But the architects of quantum mechanics in the 1930s were aware of this link to Eastern thought. And I should mention that the Dalai Lama himself is specifically interested in theoretical physics, partly, I think, for this reason.
Yeah, okay. I think that does deserve another session, but it would more than we can do at the moment.
We need another grant from
we do.
John Templeton Foundation.
Yes.
This question is from JW, and it's addressed to anyone. Why do you think God does not manifest itself clearly and directly as a tangible being in the present with whom we can interrelate? It would seem that God's tangible presence is absent, and is his absence intentional? And if so, why?
Well, it's a bit like physics. You might say, why is it, as Paul pointed out, so difficult to think that there is something we cannot see which accounts for everything that exists? You need to make a leap of intellect to see the foundations of reality. And I think if you stop thinking about God as a person who walks around and says, "Hello, here I am," and you think of God as the ultimate source of all beings, you'd expect the knowledge of God to be at least as difficult as the knowledge of physics. And therefore, it wouldn't just be obvious to everybody. It's because you're thinking, because he or her, she is thinking of God too anthropomorphically and thinking, well, surely this this person has a body and could walk around and show people. But if you say, no, it's something like, this is just a remote analogy, it's something like the ultimate undescribable ground of all beings and the source of every possible world and the source of supreme value. And if you talk about that, you say, well, how on earth could it show itself? Well, Christians have a guess, but it's even then difficult to detect. It should
of course,
be
a non-theist will say, well, that's very convenient then, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Well, whether you're a theist or an atheist or some other mode of thought, there's a Tower of Turtles in the famous metaphor, and something's going to hold it up unless it is a bottomless pit, and that something could be the ground of being, as Paul Tillich would describe it. And you think of God as that rational ground that explains that. I don't like the word cause, because that, to a physicist, that has very specific meaning. But explanation, the world is explained because of some supporting super turtle that's holding this whole lot up. And of course, that doesn't have to be any being in the anthropomorphic sense, or anything even remotely like a model of God that anybody has so far thought up. It might be something mysterious and beyond our ken. Of course, there are many religions in the world, and some not organized religions, but just systems of thought and mysticism and so on, where the stress is laid on the unknowable. We cannot know. It's all part of the way the universe is put together. The ultimate source of being is unknowable to we finite human beings. That's a very rich tradition.
Accepting that, I want to say that I honestly think that when you touch and appreciate beauty, that is touching and appreciating God. And when you appreciate and obey a moral obligation, that is meeting God. So if you don't think too anthropomorphically, you think, when do I meet occasions of value which seem to come from beyond myself and maybe to an extent transfigure me, that's God. But that takes a lot of working out.
Here's another question, and this is actually one from Barry Ritchie. Could recognizing the religious roots of modern science promote better engagement of religion and science today? So I think that question is really for all of you. But I might start off by saying, is there really a schism between religion and science in other parts of the world, or is this more a United States phenomenon? What's it like?
I say certainly in the Islamic world there is a real issue in Islamic countries, Pakistan, even in the Middle East, even in the sort of wealthy Gulf states that are trying to sort of be as westernized as possible. There is a real suspicion of science, that science is an atheist Western construct being imposed on them, and they don't trust it, and they feel somehow it's going to detract from their faith. And there, I think, explaining that their ancestors 1,000 years ago had no problem whatsoever in trying to rationalize the world and nevertheless remain faithful to their faith, I think is really important. I think there really is a problem, and it's not that science is encroaching on religious thinking and forcing religious ideas to have to be overturned. It's simply that people feel, maybe the same as in the States, just feel nervous that science is somehow a threat in some way.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
I would add to that fear and suspicion two words. One is modernity and the other one is secularism. So I think that's kind of what a lot of people, because we have it in Judaism too, certain parts of the ultra-Orthodox world, really feels very, it's not just skittish about it, but really oppositional and critical of that world. So what's at stake for them is not the way we in this conversation can talk about God and about beauty and about morality. No, what they see is precisely this fear of secularism, of kind of society that doesn't really care about what the religious person cares about, and the response is a defensive response. And then you say, okay, I'm not going to allow my children to learn anything. I'm not going to teach them what they need to know. And that, to me, at least for the future of Judaism, is a very dangerous move, especially in Israel, because if that's going to be the norm, we're in big trouble. So in Israel right now, there's a major struggle going on really about what kind of education children should have, and should the state force ultra-Orthodox children to study science? And many Israelis would say, yes, that should be the right way to go, but they resist. The Orthodox community resists it, and who knows how it's going to end. But I think in 2030, Israel will have 30% of its population as Orthodox Jews. And if they are going to be ignorant of science, the future of Israel and the survival of Israel is going to be on the line, or at least going to be in question. So I would say that science is crucial, and what we need to do as historians, as cultural interpreters, is to explain the complexity of the modern story and to try, that's the answer to Barry, to try to move beyond this perception of necessary conflict between science and religion. And by looking at the medieval example or the modern example, we can show how they really always work together. And with all the complexity, we have to teach that as well. But it's not either or, it's both and. That would be my answer.
Keith?
I agree with that, but I'd also think that looking at Christianity, in fact, the interpretation of Christianity has changed about every 50 years throughout history. There have been different interpretations. St. Augustine, for example, said anybody who thought Genesis was literally true was an idiot. That was Augustine. So it's not true that there's always been one unchanging belief. Beliefs have changed, and what religious people need to do is accept that difference does not mean hostility. And that's most important. And some scientists manage to do that, though not all do. And I think religious people need to do that and say, yes, diversity is not bad, it's permissible, and you can accept and promote diversity while still holding the beliefs that you think to be true. And that seems to me very important in religion. I speak as a minister. Really.
Can I throw in a comment about this? Because my interest in the intersection of science and religion goes back to my mid-teens. I read two books simultaneously. One was called Honest to God by John Robinson, who was the Bishop of Woolwich in London at the time. And the other was Frontiers of Astronomy by Fred Hoyle, who was a somewhat heretical cosmologist and astronomer. And so here were two people sort of questioning many of the foundations of many of the tenets of their respective belief systems, but with a lot of overlap in the subject matter, you know, struggling to sort of understand the life, the universe, and everything, our place in the grand cosmic scheme of things. And so, you know, I got really fired up by this cultural overlap. And in the early days of my career, there were a lot of meetings and discussions between scholarly theologians, ministers of religion who studied some science, liked to talk about things in a non-dogmatic way. And we used to meet, and Keith, you must remember many meetings, you know, Vatican and elsewhere, where we would talk about some of these things in a very productive way. And then it all soured because of the growth of sort of militant atheism. It wasn't enough for people to say, well, I choose not to believe many of these things, but I think you people are evil, and that I'm really want to go on the warpath. And the media, of course, loves that. And so thereafter, so many discussions, whether they were public or private discussions, where it took place in this atmosphere of antagonism, that there was one side was right and the other was wrong, and it just degenerated for really quite a long time. But I do see a glimmer of hope now. We're having this conversation, and we don't have to take fixed positions, and we come from rather diverse backgrounds, but we find that there are common areas that we can talk about. And I would like to think that there could be many more conversations of this sort here and elsewhere, in which people don't hurl abuse at each other, and they look for what we have in common and how we can move forward when we all recognize that we don't know everything, whether we're scientists or theologians or whatever religious tradition. We don't know everything.
You and Jim have told me more about the beginning and end of the universe than the Bible has.
Say that as a minister.
Keep
Can
reading
I-
the books.
That's why my congregations walk out, actually.
Can I just finish with one very last question? Paul mentioned the future. This ties into a question from Thomas, and what's the panel's perspective on the future relationship between science and religion in the next 10, 20, 100 years? And we only need a very quick answer from all of you, because then we have to end. So, Jim, can you start?
I'm not quite sure what I can say. I think it's, in the perspective, for Muslims who are concerned that science is encroaching on their faith and belief and the teachings of the Quran, is what Hava was saying, that you don't take your religious teachings literally. You learn about the world through science, and you use that knowledge to better understand your religious faith. I don't see there's any need that they have to conflict. I know many, as Paul says, probably the majority of scientists are not religious, but I know many scientists who are, for whom their faith is very, very important. That doesn't make them any less a good, as scientists. I think more dialogue like this is the way to go.
Okay, how about you, Paul? Do you think there's such conflict between religion and science?
Well,
carry on?
Well, I would like to finish with the vision of Sir John Templeton, whose money has enabled us to hold this event, because of course he was a great believer that you don't look backwards to receive wisdom and say that's it. He'd love to say we only know 1% of reality or divinity or whatever you want to call it, and he had this idea that there can be progress, so that we can come to better understand through rational inquiry and the scientific method, better understand the world. And so he had this very forward-looking view, but it was founded on this, his motto, how little we know, how eager to learn. And I think that's just a great way to approach this subject. And I hope he's right. He had 1,000-year vision. 1,000 years, we will make a lot of progress, and there won't be this conflict.
Quick comment, Hava, if you happen to have one.
My quick comment would be that we need to assure that our next generation will not become anti-intellectualist. I'm very concerned about the anti-intellectualism that is very rife in our society across the world. And our job as educators is to dissuade young people to explore, to use their rational powers, but not think that rationality necessarily conflicts with their emotions or with their spiritual aspirations. On the contrary. So if we can convince our students that you can really have it both, and take religion seriously and take science seriously, and above all study history, and I think we can get somewhere better.
Quick comment from Keith.
I just say, I think diversity is the mother of creativity.
Okay, thank you. That's been fantastic. Thank you also our wonderful panelists, Jim Al-Khalili, Keith Ward, Paul Davies, and Hava Tirosh-Samuelson. And thanks to the audience for your questions. They were great. And don't forget that you can go to our website to download our past events, including one of the last interviews with the late, great Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Conversations on religion, ethics, and science is supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And our thanks once again to Professor Barry Ritchie from ASU and Ben Sanders from the Arizona Center for Christian Studies for their inspiration behind the course events. I'm Pauline Davies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.